Before you start this episode, this is just a reminder that History Hack does have a Patreon account and a Ko-fi account as well. You can either register to subscribe and throw us a few quid every month, or simply buy us enough caffeine to continue through to the next episode, because frankly, we run on fumes most of the time.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of History Hack, and I'm going to pass over to Alex for the details of today's episode.
Oh, I'm very excited today, and the reasons will become immediately clear. Allen Packwood was with us today. He is the director of the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge, so you can guess where this is going. He's here today to talk to us about his new book. So, Alan, what can there possibly be left to say about Winston Churchill?
Well, that is the obvious question, isn't it? I mean, this is a man who has been written about perhaps more than any other figure in modern British history, not least by himself, of course, with his multi-volume history of the Second World War. And this is the man who stood up in the Houses of Parliament after the war and said that he thought it would be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as he would write that history himself. And
he wasn't afraid to waffle off.
And write it, of course, he certainly did. And he also generated an enormous archive, which is what we look after here at Churchill College in Cambridge. 2,500 boxes, an estimated million items. But you've also got an official biography started by his son Randolph Churchill, finished by Martin Gilbert, that runs to a staggering 8 volumes with 23 companion volumes of letters. So my latest book, edited with James Drake, I'm describing as the antidote to the official biography and the companion volumes. This is a selection of about 100 key letters, largely but not entirely written by Churchill, which tell the story of his life in his own words, and give people hopefully a sense of the archive, and which will hopefully act as a starting point for those people who then want to dig deeper into all of the other resources I've just mentioned.
Yeah, it's definitely, it is an antidote to a massive 1,000 page book on Winston Churchill where you think, oh my God, I could kill spiders with that thing. Churchill College Archives are amazing. I'm just going to say it now. It's probably one of the least bureaucratic and unfriendly, because it is daunting approaching archives sometimes, and yours isn't at all. It is brilliant, and everyone is always.
Well, we have a wonderful team, and everyone here really enjoys doing what we do. And there is no point preserving this material unless we're going to make it available.
Yeah, and it is absolutely not all about Winston Churchill. I was giving all my secrets away. Now you've got Rawlinson's stuff, which obviously I've been up and trawled a fair amount of that, but so many key figures, especially for First World War historians, 20th century historians, so many papers, so many people that are significant as well. So do pay them a visit. But we're going to endeavour to ask you questions that you're not going to get asked a million times when you're trying to sell this book. So we're going to try and make this fun in a certain way for you, and not repetitive and boring. So let's start by talking about the beginning of the book then. So what did Churchill's early letters tell us about his relationship with his parents? Because they're not the greatest example, are they?
No, I don't think they are. I mean, I think in modern parlance, you'd call them A-listers. His father was a sort of rising star of the Conservative Party. His mother, of course, a famous society hostess, all of which meant that they didn't have a great deal of time for their oldest son, who as a consequence is sent to a succession of Victorian boarding schools in Ascot, in Brighton, and then in Harrow. Now, of course, you could say that was normal for children of the aristocracy at that time, which I think is true. But I think what's different here is that Churchill seems to have been particularly sensitive to it. He doesn't appear to have made friends very easily. His brother is much younger than him. And you certainly get the sense that he doesn't fall in easily with school ways or school discipline. He's really a bit of a loner. His letters are full of appeals to be allowed to come home. So we feature in the book correspondence with his mother from June 1887, when he's 12 years old and at school in Brighton, and he begs her to be allowed to return home to attend Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. in large part because he wants to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West Circus. And he bombards her with letters, even dictating the form of words that she should use to his teacher. And he comes over, I think, in these early letters as quite naughty, quite needy, and also, of course, quite sickly. And then, of course, his parents' despair. One of the letters describes him as an affectionate son, but that his work is an insult to his intelligence, and that it is that thoughtlessness of yours which is your greatest enemy. But that's very mild compared to what his father says. His father, perhaps in the early grip of syphilis or a mental illness, goes much further, and he sends him 2 excoriating letters. The first for only getting into the cavalry class at Sandhurst, and the second one for losing a gold watch that he's given him. And the first of those letters, letter of the 9th of August 1893, I think is a terrible letter for any son to receive from their father, even allowing for the different norms of the time. Just give you a taste of it. Lord Randolph writes, "I'm certain that if you cannot prevent yourself from leading the idle, useless and unprofitable life you've had during your school days and later months, you will become a mere social wastrel and one of the hundreds of the public school failures, and you will degenerate into a shabby, unhappy and futile existence." And then, of course, he signs off, "Your affectionate father."
Yeah, I mean, it's not, they're incredibly harsh at how they get the message across, but they're not wrong, are they? He is a classic example of one of these people that is exceptionally bright, but absolutely rubbish at school. I'm not saying I'm exceptionally bright, but I hated school. I did not do well at school, and I'm not a moron. And he's definitely an example of someone. Is he bored? Is he that bright that he's bored?
I think so. I mean, I think it's quite clear if you look at his school reports that the ability is there, but he's just not using it. You know, it's the conduct that's bad. The headmaster will say conduct has been exceedingly bad, cannot be trusted to do any one thing. He's always late. He's not looking after his things, but yet they have to grudgingly admit that he has good abilities. And Churchill himself, I think, later wrote in his autobiography of his early years, My Early Life, that where my interest, reason or imagination were not engaged, I would not or I could not learn. And I think that goes to the heart of it. It has to be on his own terms. He's a bit of a loner. He's independent. He's stubborn. He refuses to fall in with school discipline. And I suppose you can argue that then there is a consistency in that stubbornness and that individuality that does run throughout his career.
To be honest, it sounds quite relatable, the idea that, you know, many of us, we're able to most absorb ourselves in something that we enjoy. And, you know, when we have to do things that aren't quite so appealing, it's, more difficult to actually kind of get yourself to do it. So I kind of understand that in a way. We're going to go on to now the kind of beginnings of Churchill's political ambitions. So you have a letter dated the 16th of August 1895, I believe, where he's already hinting at an idea of some ambitions in politics after kind of discussing his connections and career in the military so far. I mean, what kind of eye do you think he had on the future at that moment?
I think he already has a pretty clear eye on the future, even though he's only 20 years old and even though he's only just really joined the army. He writes in that letter, "The more I see of soldiering, the more I like it, but the more I feel convinced it's not my métier." And then he adds that it's a fine game to play, the game of politics, and it's well worth waiting for a good hand before really plunging in. And I think you can see that he's already decided that he wants to leave the army. He wants to go into politics. And I think the catalyst here has been the death of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who dies in January 1895 at the age of just 45. Now, on a practical level, that frees Churchill from the burden of his father's expectations, which we've just alluded to. And it allows him, I think, to emerge from his father's political shadow and to contemplate a political career on his own. But on an emotional level, I think that he also feels he has to prove himself to his father's ghost. And the strategy which he uses and which you can see in these letters is to try and get himself transferred to as many dangerous places as possible, get himself shot at, and then write up his adventures as newspaper articles and then books. Because that that earns him money, which he's going to need if he's going to pursue a political career. But perhaps more importantly, it also gets him noticed. And this is a strategy that Churchill uses all the way through his career. He underpins his political career with words. And I think in these early letters from this period, 20 to 25, when he's in the army, when you read them, you can sense his impatience, but also his self-confidence. As he puts it, he has faith in his star. He's determined to beat his sword into a paper cutter. And you can also see him making his first attempts at speech making and developing his political views. In one of the letters in 1898, he concludes that in politics, a man, because of course he is thinking very much in terms of men in politics, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure. A man, I take it, gets on not so much by what he does as by what he is. It is not so much a question of brains as of character and originality. Introduction, connections, powerful friends, a name, good advice well followed. All these things count, but they lead only to a certain point. I should never care to bolster up a sham reputation and hold my position by disguising my personality. And I think that's interesting because, of course, he never does disguise his personality. This is someone who goes out of his way to be noticed, out of his way to be eccentric in his dress, the spotted bow ties that we all know, the omnipresent cigar and the eccentric range of hats and so on.
Baby Churchill is a bit of a sexist pig, isn't he? So he cannot think why women would need a vote when the men can make the decisions for them and stuff. But what I like about him is he's not afraid to then take that back and learn, actually, that's a really ridiculous stance to have when he marries Clementine later on.
Yeah, well, Clementine, of course, is more liberal than he is, even though he's a liberal at that point in his career. And she certainly differs with him on the issue of female suffrage. I think you can see her sort of working behind the scenes to undermine that position. But I think the other thing that undermines his views on female suffrage over time are inevitably the two world wars and the role that women play.
As well, isn't it? It's like people like to say, but Churchill once said this. Yeah. People evolve and change, and he had a very long life, and his opinions changed as he got older, and that's just like one example of it. I think people would be surprised to know how famous a correspondent he was, war correspondent, before he got into politics. Like you've explained that it's sort of means to an end for him. He has to pay his own way. He's not having fun in India though, is he?
No, he's not. Largely because his regiment is posted to garrison duty in Bangalore in 1895.
That does not make a good story.
No, he considers it a complete backwater. All right, it's a luxurious one. He has a large villa. He has lots of servants. He spends his time sort of playing polo at quite a high level. But really what he's trying to do while he's in Bangalore is to get out of Bangalore and get himself transferred to active theatres of war with varying degrees of success. And I think it's interesting because I think this period does cover his views colour his views on India. He never visits India again in later life, in spite of leading a campaign against greater Indian independence in the early 1930s. And his views of the subcontinent, I think, are undoubtedly shaped by his experiences as an officer. I think he imbibes those pro-empire, anti-Hindu racism of the officers' mess. And his views on religion, for example, as expressed in one of the letters in the book to his former Harrow headmaster, show that he sees no point in missionary work in India because he doesn't believe the Asians are sophisticated enough to appreciate Christianity. So you can certainly see it colouring those views. You can see India having this effect. In terms of his views evolving, I think his views on empire remain fairly constant. I think, he is a lifelong imperialist. To him, India is a means to an end, a means to a personal end in terms of advancing his career and getting into politics. But I think India is also, for him, about British power and British prestige on the world stage.
And continuing with his time with the military, and so other examples we have him seeing action in Sudan and as a war correspondent in South Africa. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you how Churchill described his times at war in these locations, and kind of, exactly the way he describes it. So did he kind of talk about it very seriously, as, he would in his later histories, or is there a kind of a youthful adventuring kind of spirit to his words?
I think there is that, undoubtedly a part of Churchill as a young man that is looking for adventure, and that does come across, in the letters and in the way he writes. I think he relishes action, but coming back to what I said a moment ago, it is adventure for a purpose. He wants to be noticed. He wants to launch his political career. So he takes calculated risks. So in the letter of the 19th of September 1897, back to his mother, where he describes skirmishing with Pathan tribesmen on the Indian northwest frontier, he writes, "I rode on my grey pony all along the skirmish line, where everyone else was lying down in cover. Foolish perhaps, but I play for high stakes, and given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble. Without the gallery, things are different." And I think that's the point. I mean, he's actually being very honest in that letter about what motivates him. This is being done to be seen. And similarly, when he charges with the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman, he makes sure immediately afterwards that his friend, Colonel Ian Hamilton, hears all about it in this letter. The letter is full of the excitement of spotting the enemy advance and then of the charge. But he's writing, I think, with a deliberate aim to leave an impression.
Royally pissing off Kitchener in the process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, he's looking to see, and actually in the letter he is very scathing about Kitchener. But I think in many of these letters, he is looking to make contacts, to impress people that might be useful to him later on. And I think, again, a recurring theme throughout the book is that Churchill's letters, even his love letters to Pamela Plowden or Clementine Churchill, are almost always really about him. They may reveal his more personal thoughts and occasionally his worries, but they're also still intended to put him center a stage in the eyes of the recipient.
It's merciless as well, isn't it? Like you say, like pissing off Kitchener, there is an element as well. Like if it gets him ahead, he will do it. He will say it, and he will.
And again, you can see that. I think you can see it all the way through his life in these letters, but particularly perhaps in this early phase, that he is intensely driven. Of course, this is the man who told Violet Bonham Carter at an Edwardian dinner party, "My dear, we are all worms, but I do believe that I'm a glowworm." And I think you're seeing that reflected in these letters.
Yeah, we'll get to what happens when he thinks he's blown it in a bit, but Beth's got a question first.
I do. So moving on to the early 20th century, there's obviously various fraught political issues going on at the time and various campaigns. So there was a women's suffrage movement, such as we mentioned, a lot going on in Ireland as well, and various things. And there's more a note for later, but he also had some strong views on female MPs as well, with Nancy Astor being the first to sit in the Commons in 1919. But with the early 20th century, what insight does Churchill give in his letters about the workings of the Liberal Party on these issues, and also his role?
Well, I think this is a really interesting phase of his life, because I think we often forget that Churchill was actually a Liberal for quite a long period, from 1908 through to 1922. Of course, he starts out as a Conservative, but he quickly changes parties when the Tories split over the issue of free trade, the Brexit issue of its day. But it's interesting, if you look at his letters as early as April 1897, while he's still in the army, before he's even entered Parliament, he's already claimed in one of the letters to his mother, featured in the book, that I am a Liberal in all but name. And I think Churchill is full of these interesting contradictions that remain throughout his career. As we've just been talking about, he was a lifelong imperialist. He believes in the direct rule of the non-white empire. But yet at home, at the same time, he's professing support for the extension of the franchise to every male, He's talking about universal education, equal establishment of all religions, wide measures of increased local self-government, an 8-hour working day, progressive income tax. And of course, as a Liberal minister, in Asquith's pre-war government, he's involved in the introduction of basic unemployment insurance and the setting up of labour exchanges, and he supports Lloyd George's People's Budget. But I think what the letters show are that there are always limits. I always think of Churchill as being a Victorian paternalist. And female suffrage is a great example of this, I think. He doesn't oppose female suffrage, but he quite clearly doesn't wholeheartedly support it either. His very first letter to his wife Clementine contains the lines that women, when they begin to think, are less capable of grasping the infinite variety and complexity of phenomena. And in 1911, he doesn't want to support the franchise bill for female suffrage because he fears that it will bring the Liberal government down over petticoat politics. And you can see sort of similar approach, I think, in his whole approach to industrial unrest and industrial relations. He's very happy to introduce these social measures as long as the working classes are working with him and with his government on it. When they ask for more, when they protest, then his response is to come down quite hard in terms of reaction. And again, I think that's perhaps an aspect of his character. It's in war resolution, in peace magnanimity. The moment anyone opposes him, his reaction is to kick back and to kick back really hard.
We've reached, speaking of kicking back really hard, right, we've reached the First World War, which is not his finest hour, personally. For those who don't know, he starts off at the Admiralty, he ballses it right up with Gallipoli and ends up out of a job. He goes and sulks at the front, is just about magnanimous enough not to demand to command a brigade when he's not qualified, but he gets his own battalion for a while, and he ends up at the Air Ministry when that's created. How does he deal with his massively fluctuating fortunes in the First World War, especially when he goes after Gallipoli? He thinks he's done. He thinks he'll never be Prime Minister, and he has ruined his career, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, this was not his finest hour. In many ways, it's his real darkest hour. And when he goes over Gallipoli, Clementine thought that he would die of grief. So, I mean, it is a real low point. And as you've just said, his wartime record, First World War record, is a real roller coaster ride. He starts First Lord of the Admiralty, civilian minister in charge of the Royal Navy, largest navy in the world. And you can see him reveling in that role. Writing on the 28th of July 1914 to Clementine that everything trends towards catastrophe and collapse, but I'm interested, geared up and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? The preparations have a hideous fascination for me. I pray to God to forgive me such fearful moods of levity, yet I would do my best for peace and nothing would induce me wrongfully to strike the blow. He loves nothing better than to be at the centre of events, the centre of the action. But then comes that terrible fall, over his advocacy of the Dardanelles operation, and which leads, of course, to the breach with the First Sea Lord, Admiral Jackie Fisher. That's chronicled in these letters. We have the letter that Fisher writes to Churchill saying, damn the Dardanelles, they'll be our grave. And Churchill's typical response, quoting his hero Napoleon, our admirals have learned where I know not that war can be made without running risks. Churchill's dismissed.
Fisher is a drama queen, though, let's be honest.
Yeah, well, in a sense, they both are, really.
Yeah, they're both as bad as one another. Like, Fisher decides that he runs away and he says, I'm running away to Scotland, I'm done. And he's not, he's round the corner in a seedy hotel. And eventually
in Charing Cross, I think.
Yeah, in Charing Cross Hotel. They're both as bad as one another.
Yeah. But Churchill's response, of course, is to try and redeem his reputation by going to the front. And we have his letters back to Clementine about that, which show that, he enjoys army life, but yet that, again, is not really where he wants to be. He can't resist the lure and the pull of Westminster, and he's certainly trying to get back. And it takes Clementine's sort of wise judgment and level head to actually tell him, to hold off, that he can't come back, too soon. And then, as you say, he finishes the conflict as Minister of Munitions in Lloyd George's government, and then as Secretary of State for War and Air. So sort of by the end of the conflict, he's back in government, but it's taken a huge toll on him, I think. The way he deals with it, I think, is again to fall back on his pen. His multi-volume history of the First World War is really a defence of his own role, and 2 volumes are devoted to defending the Dardanelles campaign. But I think it also has an impact on his own worldview. He comes out of the First World War as a more scarred individual. He comes out, as very concerned about the decline of Britain in the world, the threat to empire, the new threat from the rise of communism and Bolshevism, the decline of the existing empires, the destruction of the world of his youth. And you can see all of that in his writings at this time, I think.
Absolutely. And post the First World War, Churchill, of course, re-enters politics as a conservative rather than a liberal. And as you noted, there's so much kind of going on in the British and world landscape at this moment post the war, with various other conflicts and unrest and economic difficulties in many countries, and more societal changes like Britain having its first female MP sitting in the Commons, for example. How would you kind of describe in this time Churchill navigating this changed political landscape and in another party as well?
Well, he lurches to the right. As the Liberal Party breaks up, he moves back towards the Conservatives. And it's interesting, on one level, you could say that there's an element of opportunism, in this. You have to say that he times his move from party to party extremely well. He moves to the Liberal Party in the Edwardian era just as they're on the ascendant, and he moves back to the Conservatives as the Liberals are disintegrating and the Conservatives are on the rise again. Famously allowing him to remark that anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. But he moves back towards the Conservatives. He lurches to the right, and he embraces anti-socialism and anti-communism, which I suppose in a way you could say links back to his Victorian paternalism, and also links into his opposition to independence movements around the empire. In 1922, he calls on the electors of Dundee to stand together against the formidable socialist attack which threatens the whole accumulated greatness of Britain. Of course, they respond by rejecting him, opting instead for the prohibitionist candidate, Edwin Scrimgeour, which must have been quite a hard blow for Churchill to swallow. But by 1924, he's back in Parliament as MP for Epping, when to his surprise, of course, he's made Chancellor of the Exchequer by Baldwin, in which capacity, of course, he rails against the general strike of 1926, arguing that behind it are Moscow influence and Moscow money, and writing that anyone can see the reasons for the policy of the Russian Bolsheviks. They argue that the more miserable and impoverished the working classes of Britain become, the better is the chance of a bloody revolution and general collapse. So you can see in this period, his real bête noire is Moscow, it's the Bolshevik Party, and he sees their influence everywhere, including in the rise of the Labour Party and in industrial disturbances in the UK.
And then we're approaching the Second World War, and I think it's safe to say, isn't it, as well, that he doesn't sit on the fence with the Nazis after fascism, after the Nazis come to power. He does not, regardless of what it means to Britain's relations with Hitler's Germany, he does not care. He will say it. He will absolutely slate them.
Yeah, and he is the interesting thing about Churchill is the way he works is through these great campaigns. He doesn't work by building up sort of party support in the House of Commons and building up a sort of group of MPs around him. He works by very public campaigns, speeches, writing, articles, taking his arguments out to the world. And of course, I think one of Churchill's great achievements is in spotting very early on that actually the rise of Hitler's Nazi movement is a greater threat to Britain and a greater threat to European stability than communism.
And in 35 or 36, there's a speech, isn't there? And it's just prophetic, where he basically says these guys will ruin the world if we let them.
Yeah. And you can see that in these private letters as well. You can see, his focus switching to Nazi Germany, in the mid 1930s, and his growing concerns about, the appeasement policies being followed by the British and French governments and by the defeatism of some of his friends like Lord Rothermere.
And then in World War II, you've mentioned that Churchill is one of the most written about people in history. His World War II is the most written about part of Winston Churchill. What kind of sense do you get from the letters that you've included of what's going on behind the scenes?
Well, I think, first thing the letters perhaps show you is Churchill, the politician, the day-to-day politician, actually sort of manoeuvring behind the scenes. So a lot of the focus when you talk about Churchill, the war leader, tends to be on the oratory, the international meetings. But actually, Churchill has a wealth of political experience by this point. When he inherits the premiership in May 1940, he's not in a particularly strong position. He has the backing of large parts of the press and the public, but he's not been elected prime minister. He's there really as the result of a Westminster coup. And one of his first actions on becoming prime minister is to write to the man he's just displaced, Neville Chamberlain, praising Chamberlain's example of self-forgetting dignity and public spirit, but also admitting that he is to a very large extent in Chamberlain's hands. And that, of course, is because Chamberlain is still the leader of the Conservative Party, the largest party in the House, and Churchill therefore needs him on board and in his war cabinet, at least to start with. So I think some of these letters show you those maneuverings behind the scenes. We also reproduce some of the drafts of his letters that show him wrestling to find the right words. So, for example, we feature the draft of his letter of congratulations to Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay after the successful Dunkirk evacuations, a letter of the 27th of June 1940. And what's interesting is if you look at the draft, it gives you a real insight into Churchill's thought process. You see him striking out phrases like inevitable losses, and the reference to the fact that the landings exceeded our most optimistic estimates. He strikes those out because he knows that this letter is likely to become a public document and he has to find the right tone. And I think there are also real insights into his state of mind and his anxieties. Just as he's writing to Ramsay in June 1940, Clementine is writing a remarkable letter to him, in which she warns him that there's a danger of his being generally disliked because of his rough, sarcastic and overbearing manner, and reminding him that with this great responsibility, he must combine urbanity, kindness, and if possible, Olympic calm. Sort of letter that only she could write, one that she clearly agonized over, writing it out at Chequers, then tearing it up, then writing it out again. But it shows the role that she's playing in trying to sort of manage him and keep him on track. And at the end of the war, in January 1945, we see his frustrations boiling over when the Labour leader, the Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, sends him a long, typewritten missive criticising the way Churchill is running his cabinet. Goes on for page after page. Churchill isn't reading his papers before cabinet meetings. He's rambling on points only tangentially connected to the subject matter. On and on Attlee goes. And when Churchill receives this letter, he's absolutely furious, and his gut reaction is to write back an equally long and cutting reply. But then you see politics triumphing over personal feelings, because in the end, he abandons that long draft and instead simply fires off a one-line reply, acknowledging that he'll always endeavour to profit by Attlee's counsels. And according to Jock Colville, his private secretary, having done that, he turned to Colville and said, "Well, let us think no more of Attlee or Hitley. let us go to the movies. And they went off and watched a film.
And so if we go now to the post-war period, so of course, as many listeners will know, Churchill lost the 1945 election to the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee. And then, of course, he does make a bit of a comeback later on in the 50s to become Prime Minister again. What can you tell us about the letters of these later years and his feelings about his political kind of career at this point?
I think what they show you is that he's determined not to give up. That sort of young, driven man is still there somewhere. I mean, he clearly feels the 1945 election defeat very personally. Clementine Churchill apparently told him that she thought it was a blessing in disguise, meaning that if he'd gone on, that the continued stress might well have killed him. His reply was simply to note that it was pretty effectively disguised to him. He was determined to come back. I think he was determined to be elected a peacetime prime minister. But he was also, I think, ready to use the sort of fame that the war had created for him as a platform in the post-war period. So in these letters, you see him petitioning his successor, Clement Attlee, over not abandoning the British Empire, urging President Truman to stand firm against communist aggression, and also campaigning for greater European Union. Though, of course, doing so from a rather conservative standpoint of a Europe of nation states, and also as part of creating a bulwark against communist Russia. So he's campaigning again, and you can see that in these letters. But you can also see, I think, his frustrations about increasing British impotency and weakness vis-à-vis the United States. And an example of that is one of the last letters that we feature, which is one he writes to President Eisenhower after the Suez debacle in November 1956, which is really a plea to Eisenhower to preserve the Anglo-American alliance, which of course Churchill sees as such a major part of his own legacy. And I think if you look at the letters, they also hint at his decline, particularly where, of course, you're able to see his personal handwriting and how that's starting to deteriorate. And, a lot of these letters do give you a real human sense of the individuals who are writing them. And I think, that's something else that we were very keen to try and bring out in the book.
And of course, it's mad just how close he still is in history. Queen Elizabeth II died last year and he was her very first prime minister. Is there anything in there about, because I think he definitely saw himself as a paternal figure then, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't included anything relating directly to Elizabeth II. But I mean, you're certainly right. I mean, Clementine described him as the last great believer in the divine right of kings and presumably queens as well. He certainly presided over her coronation and saw that as an opportunity to try and sort of boost Britain's role and image on the world stage. Well, while we don't have any letters from either to or from Elizabeth, we did get the permission of the late Queen to include a letter from her father, George VI, to Churchill, which is a very famous letter where the King has to persuade Churchill not to try and accompany the troops on D-Day, which Churchill had suddenly decided that he wanted to do. And constitutionally, the only person who could order him to stand down was the King. Even then, it takes 2 handwritten letters. The second one delivered by dispatch rider to Churchill's train on the south coast as late as the 2nd of June before Churchill stands down.
There's an element, isn't there, of the adventurous boy that never ever goes away, no matter how old and frail and overweight and drunk he gets. On that note, this has been brilliant. I just want to ask you before you go, so we've mentioned obviously how much is written about Churchill. What do you think that this book is going to show people? What are the usual histories and accounts of him gloss over?
Okay, well, certainly the letters show him in the moment. without the benefit of hindsight and reflection. I think, as we've touched on, they show him as driven, self-confident, and perhaps as more political than is often sort of attributed to him. They also, I think, show his personal relationships alongside his professional ones. So his reliance on the sound judgment of Clementine, his tempestuous relationship with his only son, Randolph. They show his ability with words, but they also show his humour. What other person, what other prime minister in the heart of war in 1943 would acknowledge a gift of a lion from the Zoological Society of London with the lines, "You are quite right in your assumption that I do not want the lion at the moment, either at Downing Street or at Chequers, owing to the ministerial calm which prevails there. But the zoo is not far away, and situations may arise in which I shall have great need of it." So what I hope the book does is to put Churchill in context and to give insights into his personality and to allow you to follow through strands in his thinking.
Absolutely. Remind everybody again what it's called.
So the book is called Letters for the Ages, the Private and Personal Letters of Sir Winston Churchill, and it's published by Bloomsbury.
Brilliant. It's excellent. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us. Do go on and buy it on the History Hack bookstore, because then we get a cut, Alan gets a cut, and Jeff Bezos gets nothing, because frankly, he's got enough money. Alan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books. You can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.